From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Now it's on to the Senate. Welcome to the Thursday edition, just hours after the president's big, beautiful bill passed the House in a squeaker, with big questions now about what happens to Medicaid, to the SALT cap. I'm Mathieu alongside Kailey, Leinz in Washington, and thank you for being with us here on Balance of Power. The Speaker, Kailey, says the bill will be on the president's desk by July 4th. Another tight deadline to follow.
Yeah, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done before then, because yes, the House managed to pass this version of the bill, but it now goes to the Senate that may want to see some changes, not just on the issues you mentioned around Medicaid, potentially around SALT as well, but also on the escalated rollback of clean energy subsidies from the Inflation Reduction Act. It's going to be an uphill climb to get this thing through the Senate as well, and the House could be looking at a very different package that comes back to it whenever this summer. Whenever
that happens, presumably before the 4th of July. But of course, we've got the debt ceiling, the debt limit to be addressed in this legislation, which could create a bit of urgency when it comes back to the House. A lot of questions, though, that we'll be talking with Chuck Edwards about. The Republican from North Carolina will give us his view in just a moment. I thought everybody was leaving town. I guess some are still here.
Yeah, maybe his flight's a little later. Maybe. He's kind to give us some time on the Thursday before Memorial Day. And that's not all we have coming up this hour. We'll also be joined by the ambassador to NATO, the U.S. ambassador, that is Ambassador Whitaker, will be with us as well. So we have a lot to get to, from domestic to geopolitics. But we begin, as always, with a check on the markets. And Charlie Pellet has a look at that from New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Kailey and Joe. That cautious comeback, losing steam. Moments ago, we had the S&P 500 index turning lower. Right now, looking at a gain of just half a point on the S&P 500 index. The Dow up 8, also little changed. The NASDAQ up 87 now, up by about 0.5%. The 10-year 4.55%, with the 2-year currently yielding 3.99%, and the 30-year 5.06%. Spot gold down $15 the ounce, 3,300 even right now on the precious metal, down 0.5%. West Texas Intermediate crude oil down 0.6%, 61.18 a barrel on WTI. Bitcoin, big story today, yet another record with a $111,000 handle on Bitcoin, up now by 2.7%. Right now, the S&P lower by a point, little change there. Investors in clean power stocks running for the exits after a massive tax and spending bill that would gut former President Biden's landmark climate law narrowly passed the House of Representatives. That bill now moves to the Senate, but shares of Sunrun, America's biggest rooftop solar company, down 40%. Solar Edge right now down 25%, and Enphase Energy down by 19%. The Justice Department probing whether Google violated antitrust law with an agreement to use the AI technology of Character AI, a popular chatbot maker. Google trading higher today. Google up now by 2%. We are awaiting the start of trading for Hinge Health, HNGE on the ticker. I'll update you on that once we get our first trades. Recapping, S&P down 3 now. Drop there of 0.1%. Balance of Power continues. What a day in Washington. Back we go once again. Your hosts, Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie Pellet, you spoke it into existence. Hinge Health just opening at $39.25 a share. That is well above the IPO price of $32 a share. So a bit of a bid as trading begins here. And as Charlie says, he'll, of course, keep you on top of that as we continue to check in with him on these markets and newly public companies. But, of course, we also are focused on politics at this hour here on Balance of Power. And if you were with us on this show yesterday at this time, we weren't quite sure if the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, was going to be able to pull this whole thing off, as he was dealing with competing factions in his conference, having made the SALT caucus happy with a lift to the cap of $40,000, angering conservatives in the process, having to offer them in exchange an acceleration in the implementation of stricter work requirements around Medicaid and in the rollback of clean energy subsidies from the Inflation Reduction Act. There was also a visit to the White House with President Trump in there as well to convince some of the holdouts. But the job was done. The bill passed narrowly, 215 to 214. And the Speaker was sounding pretty happy about it this morning.
We look forward to the Senate's timely consideration of this once-in-a-generation legislation. We stand ready to continue our work together to deliver on the one big, beautiful bill, as President Trump named it himself. We're going to send that to his desk. We're going to get it there by Independence Day on July 4th, and we are going to celebrate a new golden age in America.
July 4th, an aggressive timeline? Maybe not. Let's talk about it with Chuck Edwards, the Republican congressman from North Carolina's 11th District, is with us. Congressman, it's good to see you still in Washington with a lot of questions about what comes next. I know this is a day that Republicans are feeling pretty great about, but it's going to go through the grinder in the Senate. And I wonder if you're prepared for the changes that will come back. Are we going to have to go through this all over again?
Well, you're right. It is a great day for America. And what we saw take place at about 7:10 a.m. this morning was the culmination of many, many months of grueling work to put the American agenda back on the plate and turn this country around. It's an exciting day.
Well, when we consider what actually happened today, everything embedded in this legislation, Congressman, obviously the House was having to work under different parameters than the Senate will. You know this, having a seat on the Budget Committee. The Senate has more wiggle room to extend tax cuts perhaps even further as they use the current policy baseline. Are you expecting that the end result of this bill, once it's gone through both chambers, is going to be a bigger price tag than what you and your colleagues just passed?
I believe that we're at a point right now where Americans are demanding more fiscal responsibility, and I think we're going to see that out of the Senate's product. I know that Americans are desperate to not see taxes go up. I think we're going to see that come out of the Senate product. I know that Americans are demanding stricter border control. We're going to see that come out of the Senate product. I believe that the bill that we see back out of the Senate is going to very closely mirror what we will send them later today.
Your colleague from Kentucky, Tom Massey, who was, of course, a no and had been through the duration, said this bill is a debt bomb ticking. Congress can do funny math if it wants, but bond investors don't. Congressman, is he wrong about the money that's being added to the debt and deficit?
Well, there's no question. We have curbed our thirst for spending by about $1.5 trillion. There's plenty more work to do, but I think that we have to take a moment and celebrate what we were able to accomplish at this momentous time. And we'll come back to work, and once we begin to see the results of this bill and the economy grow by not allowing taxes to go up and putting that money back into the economy, we'll be able to take another more stringent look at the spending bills of the future. But we have curbed the thirst for spending in a way that you've not seen up here in D.C. for a while.
Well, as you talk about the potential economic benefits of this legislation, Congressman, are they in no way, in your mind, offset by existing tariff policy or the risk of higher tariffs that still could come in the future?
Well, what we're seeing out of tariffs right now is budget surpluses. We're seeing income that has not been yet placed on the balance sheet of the United States. That is not fully baked in. I think what we're also going to see as President Trump continues to negotiate with these tariffs would be even a stronger economy with more investment here in the U.S. and more jobs.
That said, Congressman, the CBO says this bill will boost the incomes of the richest 10% of Americans while lowering the incomes of the lowest 10% of Americans. How does that resonate in your district?
Well, CBO has not had a very good record in being right. The reality is right now, the tax rate for the highest earners in America is 37%. And when this bill comes into law, the highest tax rate will be 37%. The left is not bothering to tell you that. They're using the old-fashioned talking point that...
Is the CBO the left?
The CBO is just inefficient. I'm not going to say that they're partisan or not, but when you go back and look at their record, they do not have a history of being accurate. We believe that the economy is going to grow at a far quicker rate than what they've got baked in right now, just as it did under Trump 45 when the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was initially put into law.
Congressman, considering your district in North Carolina, I also want to ask you, as we approach the beginning of hurricane season here, knowing you've called for reforms to FEMA, about the warnings internally that FEMA has delivered about being unprepared for this hurricane season, in which there's now suggestions we could have up to 19 named storms. Are you concerned about the impact potentially on North Carolina, about a lack of preparedness as we enter these next months?
Well, I certainly believe that Western North Carolina has seen its worst hurricane in many, many decades. I'm more concerned about rebuilding from last year's hurricane. There's no question FEMA needs to be reformed. It failed North Carolina in so many different ways. I'm happy to have had the opportunity to suggest to the President some reforms that should be put into place now to help whoever the victims of the next storm might be.
A lot of people remember your response to Hurricane Helene and your attempt to debunk some of the myths that surrounded the response, going so far as having to write that Hurricane Helene was not geoengineered by the government to seize and access lithium deposits in Chimney Rock. This was back in October of 2024. Congressman, I'm glad that you brought this up. What else does Asheville and the Hill Towns need at this point to rebuild?
The biggest thing that we need right now is to continue to dismantle the bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. I'm really happy that President Trump has been to Western North Carolina on a couple of occasions. I'm excited that he assigned me to a special task force to offer recommendations on how to accelerate our recovery. But there's much, much more that we have to get out of the way in Washington, D.C. We have a substantial funding package that I authored back in December, and now there's hundreds of millions of dollars in the hands of federal agencies, but we're having a really tough time getting it into the hands of the people that need it most. That's the number one thing that we need in Western North Carolina right now.
All right, representing Western North Carolina, specifically North Carolina's 11th Congressional District, Republican Congressman Chuck Edwards joining us live from Capitol Hill here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We appreciate your time, and we want to turn now to our political panel as we continue to assess the legislation that the House was able to narrowly pass early this morning, and turn to Rick Davis, partner at Stonecourt Capital, Bloomberg Politics contributor and Republican strategist, alongside fellow Bloomberg Politics contributor Jeanne Zaino, our Democratic analyst and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. We just heard from the Congressman there, Jeanne, sounding pretty confident that he thinks the Senate isn't going to make many changes to what he and his colleagues were able to get across the House floor this morning. Is that also your working assumption?
It is not. I give him a lot of credit for being so optimistic. I'm sure he's on a high right now that they passed this bill because, of course, that wasn't certain. But, you know, I just go back to what Lindsey Graham rather said when he said that, you know, you had your turn of the House and now it's our turn. And what we're hearing out of the senators is that they are going to be moving this bill in a direction that is not going to be beloved by members of the House Freedom Caucus, in particular, as it pertains to budget and spending. I mean, the reality is this bill adds an enormous amount to the deficit. And that's why those who are fiscally conservative and are consistent in that, like Massey, voted against it. It is will blow up the deficit. And that's something our kids and our grandkids will have to pay for or reconcile with.
We heard from Hakeem Jeffries this morning. Rick, he says Democrats just won the midterms. Of course, he's looking specifically at Medicaid cuts, along with some other items here. Can the Senate change that course, or is he right?
I think the Senate can soften that up a little bit. There's no question that there are senators very concerned about the Medicaid cuts put in by the House of Representatives and are likely to change some of those provisions. But the reality is you just can't get the addition to add to be right on this unless you find spending cuts that can defray some of these other spending items. And so the Senate has a tough job because it's not only the math, but it's also, as you point out, the messaging on this. You know, what is going to be the Republican talking point? We just heard, Congressman Edwards talk about tax cuts, tax cuts, tax cuts. And the irony is that these are tax cuts that everybody enjoys today. So it's really the extension of those tax cuts with some additions like no tax on tips and some other things that the president campaigned on. So I think we've heard the Republican talking points, and I think we now know what the Democratic tax lines are going to be relative to Medicaid. And I think we're already seeing the midterm play out in real time right now. So game on. Let's see how this all shapes up. But it's awful hard to convince the American public voters that they're getting something special when they look at their tax bill. It's going to be the same as it was last year.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Rick, there's also the consideration of the parliamentarian in the Senate and whether they will rule that everything that was in the House bill is actually acceptable under the rules of what can actually be in a budget reconciliation package. Knowing that the Senate just today voted to block California's ban on gasoline-powered cars starting in 2035, despite a ruling from the parliamentarian that the Senate did not actually have the authority through the Congressional Review Act to overturn that EPA waiver that was, of course, done during the Biden administration. Does that suggest to you that they would be willing to overlook the rulings of the parliamentarian in this process or in any in the future?
I think it's a little bit of a one-off. Every senator I've talked to indicates that the Byrd rule, this idea that reconciliation bills have to pass certain scrutiny and it must be fiscal issues involved and not policy issues, is, from what I can tell, still going to be a major hurdle for a lot of the things that are in the House bill and will simply be dropped from the bill based on the parliamentarian's ruling. Now, what's replacing them is the big question mark. And the House bill also didn't have a lot of detail in the reconciliation. It had huge chunks of money, hundreds of millions of dollars for things like border control, but they did not articulate what the border control would be, whether it's, just general policing of the border or building a fence. There's typically in budget bills, you have a lot of detail. I think we'll see more detail coming out of the Senate on how they want to see all that administration spending.
Jeanne, you just heard our conversation with Chuck Edwards, the congressman from North Carolina. He likened the CBO to the left, suggesting that there may be political motivations here, and we've talked to a lot of Republican lawmakers who simply don't think that the Congressional Budget Office, billed as nonpartisan, is trustworthy. They're looking for dynamic scoring. They don't believe the numbers that they're hearing from the CBO when it comes to increasing the debt and deficit. How do we get around this? And how do we find an objective arbiter when it comes to legislation?
The CBO is an objective arbiter. The problem is whether it is the Democrats or Republicans, any pronouncement by the CBO is if it's in violation or if it goes against what they want and what they hope, they then describe it as partisan, describe it as untrustworthy. Yeah. And the reality is the CBO is made up of very, very good people, smart people, economists, other people who know what they are doing, and they are not driven by partisan means. So I think we have to, listen to some of those complaints with a bit of, just understanding that when the CBO says something they don't like, that's always been the response.
Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis will be back a little bit later on this hour with a breaking headline on the terminal now. President Trump will attend the G7 meeting in Canada. That's according to Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary, just now briefing reporters at the White House. We'll have a lot more ahead, including our conversation with the U.S. ambassador to NATO. Straight ahead here on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
In Washington, where, of course, much of the Capitol has been focused on Capitol Hill today for what happened in the House, the passage of the budget reconciliation plan, the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill, 215 to 214. It now goes to the U.S. Senate. But on the floor of the U.S. Senate today, the Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, was actually focused on something else, and that is the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine and the pressure that the U.S., the Senate included, is willing to put on Vladimir Putin to agree to a ceasefire, including a bill, of course, drafted by Senator Lindsey Graham that threatens further sanctions on Russia if there is not progress made on that front soon. Here is Senator Thune on the floor earlier.
The Senate stands ready to act. Thanks to the dogged work of Senator Graham, we have bipartisan legislation co-sponsored by 80 of my colleagues to impose additional economic sanctions and tariffs on Russia. If Russia is not willing to engage in serious diplomacy, the Senate will work with the Trump administration to consider additional sanctions to force Putin to start negotiating.
This is where we start our conversation with Mathieu Whitaker, the U.S. ambassador to NATO. Joins us live now from the North Lawn of the White House. Mr. Ambassador, welcome to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's great to have you. Are you concerned that Capitol Hill, that the legislature could complicate matters and in fact interfere with peace talks between Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, well, obviously, first of all, it's good to be with you. And I think the peace talks, while ongoing, I think we're struck a small blow with, Putin sending a low-level delegation last week to Turkey, and where we find ourselves. I've been reading news reports this morning suggesting that President Trump continues to be frustrated, and obviously anything that happens up on Capitol Hill, will most likely be, as Senator Thune said, will be in concert with President Trump. So I fully expect that will be hand in glove and help hopefully advance the peace process ultimately.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, you referenced news reports. I would love your take on the news that was reported in the Wall Street Journal that President Trump told European leaders in a call earlier this week that Putin is not ready to end the war because he thinks he's winning. Is that a sentiment he shared with you? Have you shared that with our NATO allies?
Yeah, I have not, but I think you can just look at, we've said often that you don't listen to the words of President Putin and President Zelensky. You listen to their actions. And right now, Putin continues to fight the war in Ukraine, continues to send hundreds of drones almost on a daily basis against oftentimes civilian targets. So I think that, would suggest that President Putin doesn't want peace yet. And so obviously the United States has a lot of cards to play in this situation, but President Trump wants peace, and what I've talked to him about is this hot war in Europe should end, but it should end when both sides can agree to some ceasefire framework and some peace plan that makes sure it doesn't fire up again, because I think that's the biggest risk, is that we might end the near-term killing, but we want to end the long-term killing. We have 5,000 people every week that are dying on the battlefield, including civilians. And I think that's just a human tragedy that needs to stop.
Have you also talked to the president, ambassador, about walking away? We've heard President Trump suggest this, as well as Secretary of State Marco Rubio. I think J.D. Vance, the vice president, has suggested this as well, that there will be at some point a line of diminishing returns where the U.S. will simply back off and leave this up to the parties who are directly involved.
Yeah, I think President Trump likes to keep all options on the table and keep as much negotiating space as possible. There are several things that he could do on really either side of the equation to try to end this war in an asymmetrical kind of way. But I think President Trump is trying to find the right circumstances and the right situation to end the killing that I mentioned earlier. But at the same time, he does not have unlimited patience. And so at some point in time, as Secretary Rubio has said, we need to address other critical issues, and we can't spend all our time trying to mediate a war that neither side appears, but especially Russia, appears to be unwilling to end.
I'd like to ask you about something else that Secretary Rubio has said recently, Mr. Ambassador, and that is by next month's NATO meeting, which is scheduled for late June, that members will have all agreed to hit a 5% defense spending target. How confident are you about that target being easily reached, and on what realistic time frame?
Yeah, well, right now, Secretary Rubio has said that timeline would be 10 years. Obviously, we're working with all of our allies to figure out what makes sense. But we need something that's different from what was the Wales pledge from 11 years ago, where everyone agreed to 2% of GDP being spent on defense, and some of our allies are just getting to that right now. And so we need to have clear stair steps to meet those goals, and at the same time, we need to make sure all of our allies understand that it's got primarily be on hard defense capabilities according to the NATO warfighting plans that actually make the alliance stronger. But remember, as I mentioned before, President Trump wants peace, and deterrence and strength are the way to bring that peace to the continent. But for too long, the European allies have relied on the United States as the primary security provider in Europe, and they need to equalize. And that's where this pledge and this commitment that we're going to see out of The Hague
really gets us to that point where they equalize, they share the burden with the United States of America, and the United States of America can address other very important security needs across the globe.
Mm-hmm. All that said, Ambassador, I go back to your testimony in your confirmation hearing, and I wonder if you see your primary goal, or if the president has told you your primary charge is to keep the peace in Europe or to get NATO members to pay more on defense and reach that 5% goal.
Well, I don't see that as an either-or answer. For me, I see that we need our NATO allies to be strong. We need them to equalize with the United States of America. And at the same time, the strength will deter Russia and other adversaries from making a move on NATO territory, and therefore we will have peace. You cannot be weak and have peace. You will be taken advantage of by those that are stronger. And so the United States is a great ally and a great friend, and we're just making sure that all of our NATO allies, all 31 other allies, are strong as well with us.
All right, Mr. Ambassador, we appreciate you joining us here on Bloomberg TV and radio today. That's the U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Mathieu Whitaker, joining us live from the North Lawn of the White House. And inside the White House, actually right now, inside the briefing room, the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt is speaking to reporters, talking about another area of conflict, specifically the Middle East and Iran, saying that President Trump spoke to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today about talks with Iran, but about also something that happened here in Washington, D.C. last night, a shooting of a couple, two individuals who worked at the Israeli embassy as they were leaving the Capitol Jewish Museum. The assailant, according to police, who fatally shot them, chanting "Free Palestine" as he was taken into custody. And as there's bipartisan condemnation against this attack, what is being described as a terrorist attack and an anti-Semitic hate crime, we wanted to get the reaction from our political panel. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributors, are still with us. Rick, as we consider the events of last night, knowing if they happened elsewhere in Gaza, for example, or in another area other than the nation's capital where other things have been taking place, I would imagine there would be a great deal more attention on it. But what is the implication here as we consider a White House that has been incredibly focused on combating anti-Semitism in this country?
Yeah, I think it's actually a message that it needs to be not just the White House, but all other institutions that we have in public and private sector. You know, Yaron Lachinsky and Sarah Milgram were beautiful young people just starting their lives together and struck down in a political hate crime. There's no question in my mind what has motivated this. Just 4 blocks from the White House, or from the Capitol building itself, it has to be unacceptable to everybody, regardless of what their political views are, what party they're in, what views are about Gaza and Israel. This should be condemned at every level. And it really needs to be a moment where we spend time on it, because if we don't, we subscribe this to history that it'll probably happen again. So, you know, I appreciate you bringing it up on the show, because I really think it's a moment in time that's important.
I'm glad you said their names, Rick. Yaron Lachinsky, Sarah Milgram were going to be married. They were set to be engaged this summer. Jeanne, what does it tell you when stories like this are emerging here on U.S. soil?
You know, it is so distressing. What a heinous act. You know, I was just learning more about Sarah, just 26 years old. She was a peace activist. She believed in reconciliation, coming to common understanding between the Israelis and the Palestinians, everything you would want in somebody seeking peace, and deeply committed to that. And just 26, for both of them to be gunned down. We've seen a shocking rise in anti-Semitism in the United States and around the world. And sadly, this unfortunately is not surprising. Anybody who is familiar with any Jewish organization in this country, I live in New York, we have a lot of them. They have extra security. Young Jewish people grow up knowing that they are a target. And of course, Sarah and her fiance, or soon to be fiance, they knew that as well. And so we do need a serious conversation about dealing with anti-Semitism that starts at the White House, as it has, but goes beyond that, to Rick's point. And let's not forget, this is coming not that long after the governor of Pennsylvania's house was firebombed. So this is a recurring, sad, and unfortunate situation in which 2 promising young people have been killed.
Well, and we also have to consider with the lives lost here, Rick, the wider context, the backdrop with which this attack happened, which is we've been talking for weeks now about what seems to be a distancing between the Trump administration and the Netanyahu government in Israel, and kind of a break in some areas of policy, not just on Iran, but also in Israel's current conduct in Gaza. What does this tragedy add, or how does it potentially alter the way in which these two are going to be interacting from here?
Well, there's no question it refocuses the public's attention and the media on the relationship between the U.S. and Israel, on issues related to anti-Semitism, on the Gulf region, and specifically what's happening in Gaza. And there's plenty to report on. This is a area that needs lots of attention. And if there is a legacy to Iran and Sarah, it would be that we spend time thinking about how to cure some of these problems. Israel can't continue to live in a hostile environment. As Jeanne said, children here in the United States who are Jewish grow up knowing they're a target, but the entire state of Israel wakes up every morning thinking that somebody is there to kill them. That is just unacceptable in a world we live in today. So I think that it is a positive that we are now going to refocus, because of this heinous crime, on an area of the world that, if it is not fixed, will come back to haunt us in the future.
Well, it does make you wonder what the fallout would be if Israel did follow through on reports of an attack against Iran. Jeanne, we heard from Dan Bongino, the deputy FBI director, after this happened. He says early indicators are that this is an act of targeted violence. I think Rick referred to this as political violence. Isn't this a terror attack that happened in Washington, D.C.?
It is. In the 19th, 20th century, they used to call it propaganda of the deed. And it's a violent action meant to influence and change public opinion. And if the reports that we heard but from what happened last night are to be believed, and we've seen some of the videos, this is part of that. So whether we call it, an act of political violence, propaganda of the deed, or just an act of violence and terrorism, the result is it does have a very difficult, chilling effect, not to mention the people's lives lost. And so there really has to be an effort in this country and around the world to combat hate of all kinds, but anti-Semitism in this case. And we haven't done a good job on that. I'm at a university on college campuses. This is an enormous, enormous challenge. And part of what is driving this is what young people are seeing in the pictures that are coming over from Gaza and from that war. So we have a president who just came from the Middle East. He did not visit with Netanyahu or even stop in Israel. So we have to think very carefully about how we deal with the challenge that is the Middle East and the war that has gone on since October 7th.
Well, Jeanne, I'm glad you raised that you spend a lot of time on college campuses, where obviously we have seen a lot of protest activity, though not necessarily all of it violent. And this is what has come to issue in the actions from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, for example, in the attempt to revoke visas of those who were found to be anti-Semitic, or in the allegations of this administration sympathizing with terrorists. How does an attack like this, which obviously is very different, an actual crime and violence committed here versus words that are spoken at a protest or that kind of thing, what does this add to the complications around how free speech and anti-Semitism arguments are at play here?
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised that, Kailey, because this is what makes it very difficult to distinguish between speech and violence. And we must, because we live in a country where we protect speech and we find any form of violence deplorable. And when these acts of violence happen, it gives rise to a lot of fear, understandably. And then there are pushes to do what the administration has been doing with some of these folks on Colombia and elsewhere. And we cannot allow that unless, of course, the law is broken, and any act of violence is a violation of the law.
We're glad we could have this conversation with Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributors. A great panel today. And thank you both for the insights. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey, Leinz in Washington. This is Balance of Power. We have a few other matters that we want to get to today. But first, Wall Street. Let's see where the markets are at right now. The Thursday trade with Charlie Pellet in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Well, hello there, Joe Mathieu. Indeed, higher across the board. The Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ all back in the green. Do want to update you on a couple of IPOs, though, closely watched. We've got first day out for Hinge Health. The stock right now trading higher by 17.4%. And Ryan Reynolds Mountain Shares, MNTN, on the ticker there, rising 47% after its IPO. Stocks higher right now. S&P 500 index up 15, up 0.3%. The Dow up 118. Up by about 0.3%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 121, higher by 0.6%. The Russell 2000 Index up 0.2%. And a surge for the Bloomberg Mag 7 Index, rallying now by 1.2%. Keeping an eye on the 10-year at 4.54%, the 2-year 3.99%, with the 30-year 5.06%. Spot gold now down 0.6%, $32.94 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude down 1%, $60.98 a barrel. Bitcoin, what a story there, 111,770 now on Bitcoin, a record up 3.3%. In sports, briefly, the Celtics sale gets a $1 billion investment from Aditya Mittal, that according to Sportico. Recapping, stocks higher, S&P up 15, now up 0.3%, and Balance of Power continues right now. Back we go to Washington once again. Your host, Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie Pellet running us through the market action. Thank you so much. And interesting, especially as Charlie pointed out, to see what's happening in the bond market today. Yields moving a bit back lower after a massive spike at the long end yesterday amid concerns about fiscal policy in the U.S., knowing that the House did just this morning pass the one big beautiful bill, as they call it, that could add trillions of dollars to the deficit. And of course, feeds into concerns about fiscal responsibility in the aftermath of last week's downgrade of the U.S. Sovereign credit rating by Moody's. And while we've been characterizing the next big hurdle in this here on Balance of Power as being the U.S. Senate, which gets this bill next, interesting to see the reporting from our colleagues that you can find on the terminal and online today that actually the next big hurdle might just be the bond market.
Yeah, that's right. I think we've been on this beat appropriately this week. You've still got a 30-year above 5%, a 10-year above 4.5%, and this is pretty good stuff. Liz McCormick sharing the byline. Trump's next hurdle, indeed, the bond market hates this beautiful bill. She's with us now, Bloomberg chief correspondent, global macro markets. Liz, we've been trying to get you on the program since it came to Washington, so this must be an important day. It's great to have you with us here. The bond market has spoken. I guess I'm just curious to see what might come next from here. The Senate is supposed to soften the edges around some of these matters. Is this factored in?
Yeah, well, I think people are saying, show me, in the sense of no one's going to believe, it could get better with the Senate unless it really does, right? I think that's what the bond investors have gotten to, that, because a few people said kind of what's new. We kind of knew this projections of how this package would go. And, there was some massaging, like you said, the overnight deals. But I think, like you mentioned, the Moody's downgrade late on Friday brought it more top of mind, the fiscal, and then the budget going through. And I think a lot of it is investors are saying to me, we'll grow our way out of this, but we don't quite believe that, right? So if you do the numbers, and the people that have scored this smarter than me have said it's still going to increase the debt, in the long run, the deficit's going up. So I think the bond market is just kind of saying, kind of enough, we want to see something to change the outlook. And remember, there's a kind of a global bond sell-off going on, with this kind of fiscal top of mind in many countries. So it's adding momentum. So I think that's the thing. And people are just worried, like, what in the end is the final package? I don't think it'll get better. Right. That's what they keep saying.
Well, so if the idea is that the final package could add to the deficit, all of it underscores the potential growing credibility problem for the United States and questions around the full faith and credit of the United States. Is there actually a chance, Liz, that there is a lack of demand for treasuries, that we actually see the bond market having difficulties with functioning properly that would require, say, intervention from the Federal Reserve as we've seen in the past?
Well, we're not there yet. I try to be calm and a voice of reason. And, people were saying to me yesterday, it's the speed of the move. So far it's been, high, above 5%, but we're not kind of going 25 basis points a day, which would be scary. So I think for now, the Federal Reserve can take calm that the market is functioning. So that's not top of mind for them. But I do think, like people were saying, something else has to change. We need another catalyst. Let's say, the budget is what it is. We need something different to really see signs that the economy is slowing, right? There's several factors that weigh into bonds. And right now, the fiscal is top of mind. But if we start in higher rates, slow the economy, right? The housing market doesn't do as well with higher rates. So people are saying it might be a little self-reinforcing that if bond yields go so high, it may slow the economy, which may make you think, oh, maybe the Fed's going to actually cut more than we think right now, which kind of is a pull down on yields. People still prefer to stay in the shorter end than the longer end, but I think that's what we want to see. Does the labor market ever crack? Not that people want that, and the administration doesn't want that, but that may slow the rise in yields overall.
All right, Liz McCormick, Bloomberg Chief Global Macro Markets Correspondent, here with us on Balance of Power with an eye on the bond market. Thank you so much. And we also have our eye on the wire, where a breaking news headline has just crossed from the New York Times as the U.S. has now halted Harvard's ability to enroll international students. This, according to a letter that was sent to the university by the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. The copy of that letter was obtained by the New York Times, in which she writes that they are informing you, effective immediately, Harvard University Student and Exchange Visitor Program certification is revoked. This, of course, Joe, would mark a major escalation in an ongoing feud between the Trump administration and Harvard. Now, not just limiting it to the revoking of funding and federal grants, but actually halting their ability to enroll international students.
Yeah, this is amazing. They've got their hands on the letter. The New York Times quoting 3 people with knowledge of the negotiations as sources here. I suspect this is something we'll be hearing about from the White House, but indeed an escalation after the president threatened to pull all federal funding from Harvard as well.
Which, of course, is in the billions of dollars.
That's right.
This is a story we'll continue to follow for you here on Balance of Power. But we also want to get back to what happened this morning on Capitol Hill, something else President Trump has been heavily involved in and cared a lot about, and that was the passage of the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill in the House of Representatives. This thing was a squeaker. Wasn't clear if Speaker Johnson was actually going to be able to get the votes.
By that, you mean one vote.
215 to 214.
Yeah.
Basically, first thing this morning after the House had to go all night getting everyone in line.
Wasn't that something? A lot of us woke up wondering when this was going to happen, and about 10 minutes later, they were pushing this to the floor. Timing was everything here, and clearly Speaker Johnson was ahead of the curve on this, as people were doubting whether this could even get to a vote this week. He was telling us it would happen by the end of the day today, and it sure did.
Met his self-imposed Memorial Day deadline.
Yeah.
So for more, we turn to Sarah Chamberlain, who's president and CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership, which of course has many members that voted for this legislation today. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio. Sarah, obviously this was hard fought. It was not easy for the speaker to get this done this morning, knowing that this is going to head to the Senate next and possibly change form. Is he going to be able to pull it off a second time if this bill does not stay exactly as it is currently written?
Yes, he will. I mean, what he did was kind of a little bit of magic. It was fascinating to watch it because a lot of it happened, as we've talked about before, at the Main Street Townhouse. But yes, when it comes back from the Senate, he will have the votes again. And it would have been a little higher margin today, but unfortunately, at least one of
Somebody
ours
fell asleep, I heard.
Yeah, nobody woke
So
him
you
up.
can confirm that.
I can confirm. Yeah, unfortunately.
There were 2 who didn't make it. It was Schweiker didn't get there either.
Well, they were kind of there, but at least one of them was there but sleeping.
Honestly, if it had been me, I would have been dozing off. That's all I know.
I mean, they've been up. I mean, actually, some of them have been up 48 hours.
Absolutely.
I mean, they were exhausted.
A 21-hour-long Rules Committee hearing or something like that.
It's been a very long week.
Well, you get a gold star again for pointing us to what was going to happen. You told us this was going to happen. And I find it interesting that we spent so much time obsessing over moderates from New York and members of the Freedom Caucus, but it was actually the chair of the Republican Main Street Caucus, right, Dusty Johnson, who played a very pivotal and quiet role in making this work.
100%. I didn't realize you knew that. Yes. Yes. So Dusty is very close with the speaker. The speaker he's very religious, and he really does believe that. I mean, he follows his religion. He does not lie to the members. He does not do door deals. He trusts Dusty 100%. So Dusty last night came over to the townhouse and said, listen, we think we have a deal. Here it is, but he needs to know what the Main Street Caucus feels. So reported back, Dusty went back, but Dusty, I mean, he's absolutely the right hand of the Speaker. There's a couple others that are as well, but Dusty really is pivotal in
It says something about the moderates in this caucus, then.
It does. The Main Street Caucus is very powerful. Extremely powerful. They hate calling themselves the moderates. I know everybody does.
I get you in trouble.
Yeah, the Main Street conservatives.
All things being relative.
But they're very important. And of course, the SALT caucus was also part of Main Street. So they worked very hard in making sure they could cover the SALT. The woman who gets a lot of credit for that is Young Kim. She's not much covered in the media, but she fought really hard along with the New York members.
Okay, so when we consider the changes that the SALT caucus were able to secure, a lifting of the cap to $40,000, the changes that needed to be made to appease the hardcore fiscal conservatives because of that higher SALT cap and bringing forward work requirements around Medicaid and rollbacks to the Inflation Reduction Act. Of those things, or potentially, I guess we could add other things in there as well in terms of Medicaid changes and things like that, what are you expecting the Senate is going to be most eager to tweak here? Even if you think it can get back through the House, what are you anticipating is the end product from the upper chamber?
Actually, neither one of those. We think those will probably stay pretty close.
Okay.
It is the funding for solar and nuclear, and that area got really cut. We think the Senate would probably put some money back into that. But the Medicaid, nobody is opposed to a 20-hour work week. And, that could be volunteering, too. And it's only the healthy. I mean, children, I know the Democrats are running commercials like the little boy in a wheelchair. He's not going to lose his coverage. It is people who can go to work in some form of work at just 20 hours. Get them up, get them out of the house, get them, doing something.
Able-bodied men,
Able-bodied men and women, right.
So if that gets tweaked in the Senate, is that unpalatable to, for instance, members of the Freedom Caucus, other conservative Republicans in the House? Or to your point, that's expected, and they're going to vote yes either way anyway?
I think it's expected. I don't think the Senate's going to tweak that. I think they're going to leave that. No, it is very popular when polled out there. Most people are not against people doing something, working for their benefits. We're not cutting Medicaid. I mean, that's the big, everybody talks about that. It's not being cut. The illegals are being removed, and that's a big thing. And the other thing they're going to do with Medicaid, which we've talked about before, is they're going to keep reviewing the rolls and make sure people who are on the rolls should still be on the rolls. They haven't been cleaned up in years.
When we think about those changes to Medicaid, though, having been brought forward to December of 2026, very, very close to the midterms, knowing at the Main Street Partnership, you also are focused on retaining that majority, and in those swing districts in particular that make or break it. Are you even just a little bit worried about the electoral implications here?
No, not really, because if it's explained correctly, which I have an op-ed that does, it's going to be fine. It's very popular. The work requirement is actually extremely popular back in our districts, and in removing the illegals from the rolls are also very popular.
This is going to require some nuanced messaging, though, and I suspect the Main Street Partnership will be deeply involved in that.
Right.
Or you have an op-ed up. Tell us where it is. This is something
not yet. We're getting ready to place it.
But you're crafting this now is the point.
We're crafting it now, so really it can be explained. This is really what this bill does, and stop hearing the rhetoric and kind of both sides. Here are the facts, and that's what we've done.
Well, of course, the bill can't do it yet until final passage and it's signed by President Trump. We heard the Speaker today say July 4th. We heard Russ Vought, the OMB director, also saying the president wants to see this on his desk by July 4th. Considering that Speaker Johnson was able to do this pre-Memorial Day recess, is that next holiday deadline now looking like a realistic possibility?
You have to ask Senator Thune on that one. I think probably. The president he gets what he wants. I mean, he really does get the members in line. So potentially, yes. I wasn't sure we'd get it done now, to be honest. Remember, I talked about it might go into June.
Yeah.
So we're certainly thrilled that it did. So hopefully Senator Thune will get it done on the Senate side.
Do we frame this relationship between the House and the Senate in the right way? Does the Senate respect the process in the House? Will they be sensitive to the five families, to the factions that we're talking about here on all of these issues? Or is the upper chamber going to fulfill its reputation of jamming the House and doing whatever it wants?
I think they understand. There's new leadership. They understand the importance of the House. The House is so close. The margins are right there. They understand if the bill doesn't come back similar to what was sent over, it won't pass again, and that then President Trump will not get his agenda.
Well, so while the Senate has this in hand and works on it for however many weeks in June, what's the next thing for the House to focus on in the meantime? We haven't seen a great deal of legislating so far this Congress.
I think they're going to sleep for a while. To be honest, I don't know. They're beginning to talk about what the next bill should be. But to be honest, all they've talked about is getting this done. So I really can't tell you. They're going to take a break, and then they'll be back and start getting back to the job.
They should come back with some steam. They're going to be marching in parades and having town hall meetings, talking with the neighbors, right?
Right. And hopefully the people back home will be supporting what they did.
Well, come back and see us post-Memorial Day. I hope you have a great and long weekend, Sarah Chamberlain. Thank you for pointing the way here. The President, CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership, and a great source for us when it comes to all things Capitol Hill and in the House. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey, Leinz. We'll meet you back here at 5 o'clock on the late edition of Balance of Power with much more to discuss on Bloomberg TV and radio.